Hey folks, you are tuning into Common Groundwater, a podcast by the Michigan Environmental Council, where we go deep into the issues that are felt across the state around Michigan's environment and bring up the storylines that can lead us toward solutions to them. You are tuning into the second episode of our mini-series within the podcast called the Polluter Rulebook, where we look at the various ways in which our state environmental department has been stymied by legislation, executive actions, etc., and essentially prevented from fighting pollution as we expect them to. I'm joined today with Christy McGillivray of the Sierra Club of Michigan.
Hello.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, of course.
Before we get into the meat of our topic today, would you want to introduce yourself a little bit to our audience, who you are,
Sure.
what the Sierra Club is, etc.?
So my name is Christy McGillivray, as you just said. I'm the political and legislative director for the Michigan chapter of Sierra Club. And Sierra Club is the nation's oldest environmental advocacy organization. We were founded along with the National Park System by John Muir. Our motto is explore, enjoy, and protect. And in order for us to do that, we have to use our legislative process and the power of democracy to make sure that we prioritize the health of our planet and people over corporate profits.
That's great. That's great. I got to say, too, that the Sierra Club office is just a few steps down from the environmental office that we're in right now. So neighbors as well, in many ways. I usually like to kick off these episodes with a little icebreaker of sorts. In our last episode, I asked Megan Tinsley, my colleague, what her favorite Great Lake was, since she's a recent Michigan transplant. I don't know, actually, if you're a recent Michigan transplant, but I'm going to give you a tougher one and ask what your favorite inland lake or river might be.
Higgins Lake is really beautiful. I also really love the Pinnebog River, and that is really fun to paddle down the Lake Huron. Unless there's been a lot of manure application from CAFOs, and then it's less exciting.
Gotcha. Is Pinnebog southeast then, perhaps?
It's actually not. It's up in the thumb.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it's a little bit anecdotal, but not entirely, because I did a little bit of water testing with Pam Taylor. But yeah, I have been paddling it for a while, and the water quality does not seem to be doing great over the past couple of years.
Okay. Well, as a thumb resident back in the day, I can see that, unfortunately, given the landscape of the thumb itself. And unfortunately for me, even though, again, longtime thumb resident, I'm going to have to pivot and go southwest for my favorite and go with maybe the Kalamazoo River. It's where I went to Albion College, and so there's a nature center behind the college that cuts where the river cuts through, and so I spent a lot of time there along the riverside.
That's awesome.
So, as you know, the Kalamazoo River has its own fair share of pollution issues as well, with an oil spill and whatnot, but that part was really nice. So in our last episode, for those folks who have tuned in, you'll know that we talked about Part 31 and some of the changes that have been made to it. One single sentence was added in the early 2000s that essentially kept us frozen in time, unable to update a number of lists, safety measures, etc. That's really kept us from, or when I say us, I mean the state of Michigan, from protecting water, wildlife, people from pollution that enters our waterways. I'd like to spend our discussion today talking about some of the other ways in which our legislators, our elected officials have also kind of eroded some of those basic pollution protections initially outlined, in our state's acts and laws. But then also look at maybe some of the bigger machinations going on that have been causing so many of these issues as well. So, long lead up, just to say, we're going to be diving into some of the other more tangential issues that lawmakers have created for our state departments. Would you maybe first want to talk about polluter panels?
Sure.
That's great. And so we're kind of going back in time to 2018 here, where our elected officials created what seems to me to be very friendly sounding committees, advisory groups meant to kind of help, in theory, our state environment department out with its rulemaking. But if you're a fan of sci-fi, you know that that benign, friendly sounding government names aren't always what they seem to be. Could you maybe give us a bit of details as to what these panels are and what they've done?
Sure. The goal of those panels was to create an added layer for industry to check the authority that Eagle has and at the time it wasn't Eagle, it was DEQ, but check the authority that the state has to actually issue limits on what they can dump and what they can do. So, you know, it was just an unnecessary level of bureaucracy that was for a department that was already overburdened, underfunded, and doesn't have the tools that it actually needs to enforce the laws that it is supposed to be enforcing. And it allowed uncredentialed individuals without necessarily public health or scientific backgrounds to weigh in heavily on processes that require science and public health backgrounds to evaluate.
Yeah. And normally, like, the creation of these sort of citizen advisory committees is nothing new to the state of Michigan. But as you pointed out, a lot of those folks that come in onto these committees are purposely chosen to be the best sort of citizen experts on an issue.
Yeah.
In these cases, it was industry.
Yeah.
Which,
I mean, it was a mix.
Yeah.
Right? And that's how they got away with it. It was a mix. And the intent was to slow everything down and make sure that industry could prioritize profits as long as possible at the direct expense of human health.
Yeah. And were they effective at slowing things down over the years?
You know, the Environmental Rules Review Committee, so that one, I believe that one has been signed by the governor, right? They've revoked that, the polluter panels? Yeah. So it's gone now, and that's great. I think it is interesting that we were able, for example, to get the PFAS MCL through, even with that extra added layer of bureaucracy. So I think, you know, it was unnecessary. There's still a bunch of hoops that have to be jumped through to get a permit. I'm glad it's gone and done. I think that it, you know, it didn't totally stop everything, and it doesn't need to be there. So glad it's gone. But I don't think it was as catastrophically bad as we were afraid it would be. There are other hurdles that are more of an issue than that.
Yeah, which I'm sure going to get into today. And just to clarify, when you say PFAS MCL, this was an attempt for folks to set some limits, some standards for PFAS
right, and they did.
They were able to do that.
So there were, you know, health limits set for 7 different PFAS compounds. At the time, they claimed they were health protective. The EPA has made it really clear that any detectable amount of PFAS has an impact on human health. So I would argue that our original PFAS MCL that passed in, I think they did that in 2019, I think, that they're not health protective anymore. We have better science. So we have to revisit that.
Yeah, the science has advanced. Yeah, that's great. Next, I'd like to pivot us to something that I'd imagine has had a little bit more effect on our state policies, and that was what we in the environmental advocacy industry would call like the no stricter than federal law. Could you tell us a little bit about this and what happened to it?
Sure. So no stricter than federal, which also passed, governor signed. What that did is it limited the state's ability to set higher standards than federal law for pollution, basically. So if the federal government, for example, had said that you could be exposed to, I don't know, like 20 parts per billion of PFOA, right? We couldn't say, no, human beings actually can't be exposed to any PFOA. We have to get it down to non-detected drinking water, right? Like we wouldn't have been able to do that. The reason actually that we got the PFAS MCL done before no stricter than federal had been revoked is that there was no actual federal standard.
Oh.
So because there's no federal standard, we could take action. But if there had been a federal standard and we wanted to go farther, we wouldn't have been able to.
Got it. So, and unfortunately, as you kind of alluded to, this no stricter than federal was also repealed.
Yes.
As well.
Yeah.
The third piece I want to bring to this conversation, and then I'll explain to the audience why we're kind of hitting all these places all at once, is something called polluter pay. This is something I know the Sierra Club has fought a long time for, and we're still fighting for today. Could you talk a little bit about what polluter pay was and what happened to it?
Sure. In the, I think it was 1990, might have that date wrong, but, you know, early 90s, late 80s, Michigan passed, at the time, one of the nation's strongest polluter pay laws. And what it required any corporation that was legally responsible for contamination to restore the site where it had polluted, to pay for that restoration and restore it to like technically feasible, available, best technology, blah, blah, blah standards. John Engler made it his mission to revoke that law in 1995, and he did. And he replaced it with something that Gelman Industries had actually really lobbied heavily for. And they're relevant because they're responsible for the toxic plume of, I think it's dioxane that is contaminating Ann Arbor's water supply. So the industry that was directly responsible for creating this toxic plume that's contaminating a water supply lobbied heavily to get off the hook for having to actually pay to contain it. I mean, they weren't the only ones leaning in, but they were a big one. And the consequences of that are being borne by citizens right now, exactly the way that the law intended it to happen, which is that, you know, regular individuals and taxpayers pay for it with the actual risks to our health and then with our own tax dollars because companies are just let off the hook. So it has been a long-term goal of the entire environmental community to restore that and require corporations to pay for the cost of best available cleanup technology. And that's the start of it. There's a lot more that you can do with polluter pay.
And there is some legislation in the works right now.
Yes.
Do you know the status of that? Do we feel confident with with that legislation as it stands?
So Representative Jason Morgan and Senator Jeff Irwin have introduced House and Senate packages. They've got a lot of co-sponsorship. The bills, they restore the cleanup requirements and require companies to pay for it. They mandate the state would cover health monitoring costs for people that are dealing with exposure. They require more reporting and transparency, which is really great. They allow the state to actually bring some claims on behalf of the public to cover cleanup costs. It's a good package of bills. They've been introduced in the House and the Senate. I think that it will be a very big lift to get them to the governor's desk until we deal with the secret money problem in Lansing, because the entities that are going to fight these bills have a lot of money.
And I think you've kind of led into maybe the second half of our discussion pretty well here, where like as we talk about issues like these polluter panels, like no stricter than federal, even like in last episode's discussion around changes to Part 31, which have kind of kept us back in 2006, it all feels on some level so absurd that the Great Lakes state is unable to effectively protect the Great Lakes in our other waters from pollutants within it. And in tandem with that, it's also feels so absurd to think that folks are voting on these things that are making these things happen, I don't know, in some ways maybe in opposition to like what Michiganders and maybe even they themselves value.
Oh, totally. I mean, like polluter pay polls at like 90%. It is like wildly popular. Like the public hates the idea that we are subsidizing corporations giving us cancer. Like that's what we're doing. It's insane. Yeah. And there will only be good political wins for acting on this. But the city of Lansing has a serious corruption and secret money problem. And I think it is going to be really difficult to actually get strong polluter pay laws to the governor's desk until we deal with that.
Yeah. That's how it is. Yeah. Which, after we take a bit of a break for intermission, I'd love to get into that a little bit more with you. So folks listening, stay tuned. We're just going to take a quick sponsorship break from CalSec Incorporated. The Common Groundwater podcast is brought to you by CalSec, an international company headquartered in Kalamazoo that provides expertly crafted ingredients that help food and beverages look better, taste better, and last longer, all naturally. CalSec has set aggressive goals to send zero waste to landfills by 2030 and to create net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. You can learn more at calsec.com. Hey folks, welcome back to Common Groundwater, podcast by the Michigan Environmental Council, joined with Christy McGillivray, and we are talking water pollution issues in Michigan. This is a continuation of our miniseries, the Polluter Rulebook, where we're looking at water pollution issues at large. And over the course of an episode and a half, we've inundated you with a bunch of different examples of how our state has been restricted in its ability to protect us and our wildlife from pollutants that have entered our water. Now I'd really like to start the work of bringing us all in, all these different issues in together to kind of connect the dots, so to speak. And we've kind of built up to that right before our intermission that we just took. Christy, you were telling me beforehand that over the past 25 years that we've covered around environmental restrictions, we've touched on the Granholm administration, the Snyder administration. A lot of the start of this all comes back to the Engler administration back in the 20th century. So years and years ago, a lot of these issues that we've seen in myriad places across Michigan law all kind of come back here. Could you set the scene a little bit for us?
Yeah, and I'm going to set the scene by sharing a quote from former Governor Rick Snyder to Congress when he was called to testify in front of the House Oversight Committee on the Flint water crisis. So what he said, we have uncovered systemic failures at the Michigan DEQ. The fact is, bureaucrats created a culture that valued technical compliance over common sense, and the result was that lead was leaching into residents' water. So the reason why I think it's important to share that quote is because those systemic failures were intentionally orchestrated. They are repeated across every issue area that Eagle touches. Now, we rebranded it Eagle from DEQ. And DEQ did not fail in the Flint water crisis. It functioned as Governor Engler intended.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think we have to go back to that, an understanding of that Engler era policy agenda in order to understand how we fix it.
Yeah. And really quick, not to derail us, but even that quote, it seems to be placing a lot of the blame on the scientists, the individuals that are doing
Absolutely.
a lot of work in the field who
Absolutely.
aren't affiliated.
It's scapegoated. What former Governor Snyder was doing there was scapegoating the staff and individuals with vague references to culture, and it intentionally obscures the orchestrated and entrenched institutional constraints that everyone working at Eagle is dealing with, and it perpetuates the problems that we're going to keep having by not accurately naming what the root cause of them is. And this whole technical compliance over everything else is exactly the problem. Over common sense, over human health metrics, over actual science, all of that. We're constantly up against that and dealing with it.
Yeah. Well, let's get into it. How did that entrenchment begin? How did these all begin?
Well, I think it's important to note too that what we're talking about is we're talking about forcing very powerful corporations to spend money that they don't want to spend, right? That is what we're up against. And so we hear all the time that, everyone loves the Great Lakes and everyone wants everyone to breathe healthy air and blah, 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 blah. But the truth is that very big, powerful corporations, and Michigan has a lot of them, don't particularly care about those things. They care about quarterly shareholder profits, and that's it. And if there are externalities like, rising cancer rates or asthma rates or, whatever, the myriad of issues associated with exposure to contamination, that's the cost of doing business for them. So the fact that we're up against that kind of money and power means that we are picking big political fights, and we just have to be clear-eyed about that. John Engler, as governor, one of the very first things that he did was he issued an executive order in 1991 that consolidated his executive power over the Department of Natural Resources, which at the time housed DEQ. And the reason that's important is because the law enforcement angle arm of our environmental laws is the DNR. It's conservation officers. So once John Engler had control as the executive office over the DNR, which was upheld by a Supreme Court decision, he split DEQ from DNR. And when he did that with a second executive order. And that actually after all the fighting over whether or not he was going to actually have power, that amount of power over the DNR, it took until, the mid-90s. That was, the first thing he did in 1990, and then it took to the mid-90s, 1995, for him to start, really his agenda now that he had the authority that he wanted. He made sure that his appointees were actually the decision makers on environmental decision making. It used to be the purview of civil servants with technical expertise, and it then the final sign off fell into the laps of appointees from Governor Engler. Public access to any sort of substantive advocacy pathways was really restricted. And combined with other administrative restructuring, he decimated the budget and staffing levels. And the goal was to give business just carte blanche and allow them to do as much as they wanted. And I think the law enforcement angle is incredibly important, because you can have the best laws on the books, but it does not matter if they're not enforced. And I'll give you a very real example. In Wyandotte, the BASF Corporation is venting toxic groundwater at an extremely alarming rate in direct violation of a federal judge's consent decree that they've been violating for over 40 years. Yeah. The law is on the books. A federal judge has ordered them to do more 40 years ago, and they're still doing it. So what is the point of having a law if you can break it with impunity? Mm-hmm. It's a really upsetting question.
Yeah. And this happened because our initial department around environment was split off into two. It took the law enforcement side and moved it away from the environmental.
And I think the BASF example, that was going on before John Engler did everything that he did. I think the reason why I like to use that example is because it is just a crystal clear example of why we need as many tools as possible to hold very powerful entities accountable to following the law. Because even when we have the strongest tools possible, a lot of times very powerful corporations will just violate it with impunity. It's just crystal clear example.
Yeah. I think too, of even instances where and this goes even just beyond environmental issues, but where a company can take a $100,000 fine and continue on doing it because to them,
cost of doing business.
Yeah, it's just a little bit of an opportunity cost in a way. I'm curious too. We spent part of our episode today talking about specific instances in which the legislature, our governors have continued to take away power from our state environmental department, from Eagle. Do these feel as if they're a continuation of Engler's sort of thinking process, et cetera, or do they feel, I don't know, or are they separate from that lineage?
I think they're directly related to that lineage, right? Okay. Because the goal of John Engler was to set up an institutional incentive to prioritize issuing permits no matter what as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. And the mandate of the DEQ under John Engler was not to actually fulfill the duties outlined in our state constitution, which require that the legislature provide for the protection of air, water, and natural resources. It was to make sure that permits were issued and no one got in the way of that. Mm-hmm. So all of the other things that we touched on around removing the polluter pay law and all the different layers of bureaucracy that would get in the way of Eagle exerting any sort of authority, the Part 31 rulemaking, all of that is different ways to interfere and check Eagle's ability to prioritize public health and protecting air, land, and water, and instead force the state really to rubber stamp and sign off on polluters dumping without any real consequences.
Yeah. When we talk solutions, when it comes to the Part 31 issue, right, which we covered on in episode 1, it's essentially taking a red pen to that single sentence that was added that changed a lot. When it comes to polluter payments, we repeal them. When it comes to some of the laws we talked about, we repeal them. But changing the system that was dramatically changed back in the 90s feels like such a Herculean task. Do these different pieces that we've touched on, Part 31, polluter panels, et cetera, do those removing them, like, are those steps toward bringing our state government, our state environmental department back to its original form again? Or
they're moving in the right direction.
Okay.
It's not enough.
Mm-hmm.
So, Engler was pretty clear. He wanted to remove public oversight. He wanted to permanently cut funding and staffing. He wanted to get rid of institutional expertise and roll back cleanup standards and change permitting criteria to make sure that companies could do whatever they wanted, right? Like that was his very clear, explicit goal. So to fix that, we have to prioritize public health protections and transparency in decision making, right? And Eagle will tell you that they can't take public health criteria into account when issuing permits. They will say that, and they're right. We have to restore environmental law enforcement capacity. If you don't have the actual credentialed human beings with the backing of the administration, actually given the latitude to do their jobs, they're not going to be able to. And we have to make sure that we increase and permanently protect agency staffing and funding levels, because you can't do your job if you don't have any funding. We have to. So those are like the three big buckets of changes that need to be made. And there's a laundry list of ways that we can go about that with administrative and legislative action. And it is going to require, to truly get there, I think it is going to require an attorney general that is bought into the idea of appropriately prioritizing law enforcement for environmental laws. It is going to require a governor that is ready to go to bat and protect the bureaucrats that are actually working at the state trying to do this, instead of throwing them under the bus in a House Oversight Committee hearing. And it's going to require the legislature to revisit and restore the actual authority that we're granting to the agency.
Multi-year process, I would imagine. If we made generational change happen in the 90s, it's going to take some generational change.
I mean, it took Engler 5 years, so.
Yeah. And that was with a lot of consolidating power as well.
Yeah, I mean, he started with consolidating power. He's very smart about it.
You talked a little bit about what it will take for our attorney general, for legislators. What will it take for us as environmental advocates, whether we're as part of organizations or just from like citizen advocates who may not have those affiliations? What's it going to take from our end? How are we going to help contribute?
I firmly believe that the secret money problem in Lansing is the biggest hurdle to getting this done. Regular Michiganders love the idea of prioritizing public health in the Great Lakes, right? And, we were talking with polluter panels and polluter pay. Polluter pay in particular, it pulls off the charts, bipartisan support, everyone loves it. We run into the Michigan Manufacturers Chamber of Commerce, American Petroleum Institute wall of money that shuts down any discussion about actually like moving this through the legislative process. So I think that there's a campaign called Taking Back Our Power right now, which is it's looking at ways to curtail how secret money flows through Lansing. And I think that it's important to have a really candid conversation about that, because if we're not talking about money and power, then we're not actually talking about.
And as someone who is much more in tune with the goings on at the Capitol than I am, and if this is too tough of a question, please stop me. But like, are those, we've talked about the corporation's point of view on this situation, right? It's the bottom line in many ways. I take it, is that how lawmakers, executive officials, is that how they're thinking as well? Are they thinking of that business side when they're making these votes or preventing these good votes from happening?
I think it'd be really interesting to talk to a variety of different legislators about that.
Yeah.
They might not really welcome that super candid conversation, but maybe they would. Maybe some former lawmakers could speak to it better than I could. What I think I can say is that the constant refrain for whoever happens to be in charge is that they have to maintain the majority. So regardless of the party, that's what they're going to say. They're going to say, we have to keep our seats, or we have to get the majority back, or whatever. Like it's just over and over again, that constant refrain. And I think the hurdle is that the amount of money that can be spent on elections to attack anyone that takes on corporations is literally unfathomable, because we have very poor transparency laws, and we are dealing with Citizens United on the books with the Supreme Court here or in the country, and you're gonna face a massive spend from very powerful entities that are going to try and defeat you, and it is scary to take that on. However, again, these are wildly popular issues. And so I think with the proper leadership that is willing to gamble on betting on Michiganders and getting that story out about the David and Goliath fight that they're picking, I maintain that it would actually be a way to maintain control and power in the majority. Because again, like, democracy supports this. Regular Michiganders support these provisions. Of course, the blowback's going to be like, oh, like all the corporations are going to shut down and leave the state and no one's going to have a job, right? That's the oversimplified response that folks have. But, we have to stop the race to the bottom.
Well, and I think too, like, our state environmental department ostensibly at one point functioned like how we want it to eventually function, and corporations weren't leaving our state en masse because of that at that time too.
Right.
So I think that's the one thing that, as we talk today, I'm always thinking back to is like how, as much pushback as there might be, at one point in time, this was the norm. Like what we're fighting for was the norm.
Right.
It was just established in the state, and going back to that isn't anything dramatic. Well, Christy, I know we're probably getting close to our time here. I want to ask you a question that, as a reporter, back in the day, I used to ask everyone, is there anything else you want to add to the subject? Anything we missed out on that you want to make sure we talk about?
Yeah, I think that, a lot of times folks are afraid of even picking the fight because they think that we're going to lose. So you might as well like cut a deal behind closed doors, right? And I think that what we've seen is that when it is incredibly powerful when regular Michiganders get involved. I mean, I can say point blank that if a legislator gets 50 phone calls from individuals saying that they are upset about something, that legislator is going to think the world's on fire. Seriously. So as worried as I am about the influence of money and corporate power in Lansing, I am like continuously in awe of how powerful grassroots action and regular people actually are. And I think not enough people know that, right? Because you're not gonna necessarily know that after you picked up the phone and made a phone call and just like left a message that completely freaked out the staffer that then went and freaked out in front of their boss that then came and yelled at me for getting too many phone calls to them, right? Like you miss all of that kerfuffle in the background, but that regularly happens. And even like good things have been ground to a halt because one legislator got a lot of phone calls on this one issue from a stupid flyer, right? So it's really heartening to see that. And as threatened as our democracy is, it is still functioning, and advocacy definitely works.
Yeah. And as a comms person, maybe that's on, the onus could be on me and my colleagues then to make sure that folks, when they leave that message on the phone, send that email, that we also are showing them that there are results
that we follow
directly
up.
Because of what they did.
That you follow up and say like, hey, like this all, like, if it's stopping a bad thing, if it's getting a good thing done, whatever, like it really works. It does. Yeah,
that's great. Before we go today, anything going on at the Sierra Club where folks can take part in, or anything that just Sierra Club in general?
Well, we've got, sierraclub.org/Michigan. You can see everything that we've got going on. And I, encourage everyone to visit the website and see what's happening. We do our lobby days, which are a lot of fun. So, we spend a lot of time talking about like Lansing and the legislature and bureaucracy and blah, blah, blah. And citizen lobbyists are highly encouraged to come join us on our annual lobby days.
That is great.
Get all the details and the gossip.
And to folks listening, we'll have links to Sierra Club's website, as well as to a little document that you've put together around some of the issues we've talked about today in the description. And we'll also include a link to the larger Polluter Rulebook website that we have going, where you can get connected with other issues and other opportunities at hand there too. So with that then, Christy, thank you so much for taking the time to talk.
Yeah,
I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. And for those listening in the audience, thank you as well. And to our sponsor, thank you, CalSec Incorporated. We'll see you later on another episode of Common Groundwater.